Order. Order. Questions to the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. Mr. Andrew Gwynne.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will first offer the condolences of I and my colleagues in the government in relation to the tragedy which occurred in Berkeley, which took the lives of 5 Irish students, and the pain of that loss is felt across the UK and Ireland. I will answer questions 1, 4 and 11 together with permission, Mr. Speaker. The Government is making progress with its obligations under the Stormont House Agreement. We've legislated for corporation tax devolution, and we expect to introduce a bill soon on new structures on the past. I urge the Northern Ireland political parties to deliver on their side of the agreement, including welfare reform and passing a sustainable budget.
Andrew Gwynne.
I'd like to associate myself with the comments of the Secretary of State. Given that many young people in Northern Ireland are given the opportunity to build a shared and integrated future through educational programmes which have been given substantial resources by the Stormont House Agreement, can she perhaps update the House on the status of these initiatives, given they're now playing a waiting game as the parties in Stormont have to agree on other matters?
Secretary of State.
An important part of the financial package offered by the UK Government under the Stormont House Agreement includes £500 million to support shared and integrated education as a crucial means to build reconciliation within Northern Ireland. The financial package is, of course, contingent on the Stormont House Agreement being implemented. The UK Government thinks that is one of the main reasons why we need to press ahead with the welfare provisions and the sustainable budget, because it would be a huge setback for Northern Ireland to lose the rest of the Stormont House Agreement, including, of course, that valuable funding for shared and integrated education.
Stephenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that the implementation of the Stormont House Agreement is the only way to get things back on track in Northern Ireland, and that the Government should continue to do all it can to achieve this?
Yeah.
I do agree. We're working hard on this. The Executive is making a degree of progress with a number of its obligations under the agreement, but it is vital that the welfare reform which was agreed in Stormont Castle and Stormont House is implemented. It's a good deal for Northern Ireland. The reformed system provides real help for vulnerable people. It rewards work. It's a better system than the one it replaces. And, of course, under Stormont Castle, the 5 political parties agreed top-ups from the block grant, which would give Northern Ireland the most generous welfare system in the United Kingdom.
Suella Fernandes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As has been mentioned, the Stormont House Agreement contained a financial package of up to £2 billion worth of additional spending power for the Northern Ireland Executive. And does my right honourable friend agree that this represented a substantial commitment by the Government to Northern Ireland, but should the agreement not be implemented, this could be in jeopardy?
It would indeed be in jeopardy, and I believe that's one of the main reasons why it is very important for the Northern Ireland Executive to pass a budget that works, and that is going to be impossible without implementation of the welfare provisions. It's incumbent on every administration worldwide to live within its means. The consequences of denying the deficit and spending money without regard to the consequences are extremely negative for frontline public services, which is why getting the Stormont House Agreement back on track is essential if we're to continue to ensure public service provision is high quality in Northern Ireland and vulnerable groups are protected.
Nigel Dodds.
Speaker, everyone in Northern Ireland and further afield agrees that the reason that the Stormont House Agreement isn't being implemented is the failure of Sinn Féin and the SDLP to live up to what they agreed to back in December and to actually implement what they agreed to and signed up to. Will the Secretary of State accept that this is now costing Northern Ireland £2 million a week in terms of loss to the public, to the block grant, hitting vulnerable people, imposing austerity and greater cuts these parties claim to be against? And will she accept that she has to live up to her responsibilities and actually take action to ensure that agreement is implemented?
I agree that every day that welfare reform is delayed and every day that Sinn Féin and SDLP refuse to live up to their obligations under the Stormont House Agreement costs the Northern Ireland Executive money. If this situation isn't resolved soon, then we will start to see a significant negative impact on Northern Ireland's frontline services, because it will not have a sustainable or workable budget without Sinn Féin and SDLP living up to the commitments they undertook as part of the Stormont House Agreement. I'll continue to work to see that welfare reform is agreed, is implemented, and the government will consider all the options.
Thank you for that answer. Can I ask the Secretary of State, given that we're now into the period running up to the 12th of July and beyond, can she accept that last year enormous efforts were made by community leaders, political parties, to ensure peace and calm on the streets of Belfast and elsewhere? Since then, she has abandoned the only initiative that was in the offing to move things forward. She hasn't come up with an alternative. Can she undertake that she will look at the parades legislation? And she has responsibility. It's not devolved. It's her responsibility, parading issues. Will she come forward with proposals to actually move the situation forward in terms of finding a replacement for the current field regime?
Well, the best way to take forward reform of parades adjudication is, of course, through the Stormont House Agreement. I understand that the Office of Legislative Counsel has been preparing the options that it was tasked to do under the agreement for reform of parades legislation. I hope that they will be published soon, and I, alongside others, will be taking part in the debate about what a reformed system of parading would look like and how it would work. In the meantime, it's of course crucially important for all of us to work together to encourage a peaceful parading season where determinations are obeyed and any protests and parades are both peaceful and lawful.
Robertson.
Mr. Speaker, with regards to setting the budget and many other decisions which need to be taken, isn't the fundamental problem that the Assembly and indeed the Executive were designed for the very good reason of bringing people together, but that does not make for an efficient decision-making body? What thoughts has the Secretary of State given to this of how we might move forward towards a position where the Assembly and the Executive can take decisions on a day-to-day basis?
I think these decisions, this type of decision, the difficult decisions on living within one's means, are more challenging in a situation which has a broad coalition and multiple vetoes. But I think where there is the political will, it is perfectly possible for the Northern Ireland Executive to pass a sustainable budget and implement the Stormont House Agreement. And that's why it's very important for the two nationalist parties, Sinn Féin and SDLP, to live up to the undertakings they made. The Stormont House Agreement was a good deal for Northern Ireland. It was rightly praised by Sinn Féin when it was agreed, and now they need to get on and implement it.
Dr. Alasdair McDonnell.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Could I reassure the Secretary of State that the SDLP has and will continue to live up to every detail of their obligations? And I'd be very glad to discuss with her, any of the details that she hasn't understood. But could I say to the Secretary of State that while the Stormont House Agreement achieved much, it didn't fully complete the circle on many of the issues that were involved? And could I ask the Secretary of State to find the government's position with regard to the Stormont House Agreement? Are they active participants for peace and progress, or are they neutral observers?
We are active participants for peace and progress. That's why we're fully engaged on our side of the Stormont House Agreement and in encouraging the parties to live up to theirs. And obviously a crucial part of the agreement is progress on dealing with the legacy of the past. And that's another reason why we would appeal to him and his party colleagues to unblock the question about welfare so that we can press ahead with those institutions which their party championed during the Stormont House talks.
Ryman Lewis.
Can the Secretary of State confirm that in the event of the Stormont House and Castle agreements being implemented, the Northern Ireland Executive will operate a far more compassionate and generous benefit system than is available in the rest of the United Kingdom?
I believe the welfare reforms that this government has introduced are the best ones for the whole of the United Kingdom. I believe it's crucial that we replace a system that has failed, that trapped people in poverty, with one that rewards work and caps benefits. And I believe that the top-ups agreed by the Northern Ireland parties at the Stormont Castle Agreement produce a useful and helpful addition to match specific local circumstances.
Ryman Lewis.
While we disagree with the government on the bedroom tax and their refusal to come clean on future benefit cuts, the Secretary of State is right to insist that these agreements are honoured without extra money from the Treasury. In the past, Northern Ireland's leaders have earned great respect for making tough choices for peace. Does she agree with me all parties must now accept that an affordable and sustainable welfare system is vital to securing financial and political stability in Northern Ireland?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for those comments. It is crucial that the Northern Ireland Executive finds a way to live within its means. They're not being asked to do anything that governments across the developed world haven't had to grapple with over the last 5 years. Their block grant actually has gone up a little in cash terms. It's only come down by around 1% per year in real terms. It is deliverable. It is possible to do this. The Stormont House Agreement delivers a good deal for Northern Ireland, including on welfare.
Question number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Ben Wallace.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 2 and 3 together. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, announced that from October the national minimum wage will increase by 3% to £6.70 per hour, the largest real terms increase since 2006. The Government is also committed to increasing the personal allowance to £12,500 and to ensuring that anyone working 30 hours or more a week on the minimum wage pays no tax at all.
Stevens.
The Northern Ireland Council for Voluntary Action has said that introducing the living wage would benefit 173,000 low-paid workers, giving them an average pay rise of £1,300 a year. What is the Government doing to help workers in Northern Ireland, which has the lowest private sector pay rates in the UK?
Minister.
One of the best ways to help the low pay is allow them to keep as much money of what they earn. And so the honourable member will be absolutely delighted by the ONS's most recent figures showing that average gross weekly earnings in Northern Ireland has increased by 10.2% in Northern Ireland over the last year. That is a whacking, massively great increase compared to the UK average of 1.7%. So I'm sure she'll be delighted to recognise that our long-term economic plan is working in Northern Ireland for the low paid.
John Woodcock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Minister, my neighbour, to his post? I hope he's successful. Now, 1 in 5 children in Northern Ireland are living in poverty. The Government isn't really considering going back on its legal commitment to tackle child poverty, is it?
No, I think this government, like every government before, has tried and continued to successfully, in many cases, deal with child poverty. And again, I have to reiterate to the honourable member, one of the best ways is to make sure that work pays and that people keep the money they earn. And that's why, since 2010, we have changed and increased the personal tax allowance from £6,475 to £10,600, which is up 63%, allowing to make sure that work pays.
Bob Blackman.
Yes, Speaker. Would my honourable friend agree with me that the key to actually rebalancing the Northern Ireland economy is to reduce taxes and reduce regulation so that the private sector invests and creates new jobs and new opportunities for the people of Northern Ireland?
I thank my honourable friend. It absolutely is the key. A long-term economic plan will deliver a rebalancing of the economy and new jobs. And that's why I'm delighted to show that 40,000 more people are in employment in Northern Ireland than they were in May 2010. Giving people a job is the quickest and fastest way out of poverty, and making sure that the Northern Ireland economy converges and improves alongside the rest of the United Kingdom is our number one priority.
9,000 working families in Northern Ireland get an average of £4,000 a year from the child element of tax credits. What will the Minister do to help them restore the money they'll lose when the Prime Minister implements his welfare cuts?
Hear, hear. The best way to help those people is make sure that there is an economy for them to go into work, rather than making them rely on benefit system. You know, it's interesting that we're the party that wants to give people a hand up, and it seems that his party wants to give them a hand out.
Durkan.
I cannot preempt job news later today in Derry, which will obviously be welcome in a city of high unemployment and a lower wage profile. But given the region's lower wage profile, are NIO ministers in conversation with their Treasury colleagues about the possible implications of the changes afoot in relation to tax credits, and not least the implications for cross-border workers?
We, of course, are always talking to the Treasury to make sure that Northern Ireland's voice is heard and its special needs obviously recognised. And I think that's one of the reasons why we work very hard with the Northern Ireland parties to ensure that, should the Stormont House Agreement be fully implemented, we can achieve a corporation tax most competitive in the rest of the United Kingdom to allow further inward investment.
Margaret Ritchie.
Question number 5, Mr Speaker.
Stay.
I have regular discussions with Treasury Ministers, including the Chancellor. The Government is providing £2 billion of extra spending power to the Northern Ireland Executive under the Stormont House Agreement.
Margaret Ritchie.
Mr Speaker, could I thank the Secretary of State for her answer? I'm glad to hear that Northern Ireland Office Ministers are in conversation with the Treasury, and I would ask the Secretary of State, would she and her Minister act as persuaders for Northern Ireland in terms of having a reduced rate of VAT on tourism for all of the UK, which would benefit Northern Ireland?
Stay.
Well, I know this is a matter of great importance to her and her party. The reality is the Government has to act with caution when it comes to reductions in taxes. We have identified further increases to the income tax threshold as our priority, but no doubt the Chancellor will be able to share more information on these matters in his budget.
Sammy Wilson.
Sure, the Secretary of State would agree with me that the last party which should be seeking additional fiscal flexibility for Northern Ireland is the SDLP, given the way in which they and Sinn Féin have put the budget in Northern Ireland in jeopardy. But could she spell out for us what are the implications of the financial mess which the refusal to implement the Stormont House Agreement has had on the budget? What are the implications for the devolution of corporation tax, which has already been agreed?
Stay.
Well, the implications are very serious. If the welfare question isn't resolved, it means the pressure on the Northern Ireland Executive budget grows considerably. It means ultimately the Northern Ireland Executive will get to a point where it cannot pay its staff, it cannot pay its bills, and frontline services will suffer as a result. And of course, without resolving this welfare question, the prospects of corporation tax actually being devolved and reduced are very remote.
Jim Shannon.
Question number 6.
Minister.
The safety of police officers and others who work tirelessly and with great courage to tackle the terrorist threat is paramount. The Government is in regular contact with the Executive Ministers, and the Secretary of State and I meet regularly with the Chief Constable, Security Services and Minister of Justice to ensure that every effort is made to tackle the threat from violent dissidents.
Jim Shannon.
I thank the Minister for his reply. The safety of police officers is very, very critical. Recently, the Policing Board have purchased Vauxhall Vector cars completely unsuitable for policing in West Belfast, Londonderry or South Armagh because of the very nature. Police officers of an average height of 5'10" with body armour, weapons, cannot get out of the car in time if attacked. The Vauxhall Vector cars cannot be armoured either. Could the Minister indicate what discussions he would have with the Policing Board in Northern Ireland to ensure that this is looked at again? Thank you.
Well, can I thank the member for his question? And as someone who previously had to squeeze into armoured cars on the Falls Road, I know I have full sympathy with what it's like trying to get in and out of those at speed. Of course, procurement decisions are a matter for the Chief Constable. However, I'm very happy to raise his concerns directly with him when I next see him and take on board the points he makes.
Lady Herman.
Very much indeed, Mr Speaker. When retired police officers have their personal protection weapons withdrawn, I'm very curious to establish what criteria the Secretary of State uses when judging appeals by these officers who feel increasingly vulnerable to attack by dissident Republicans.
Well, obviously, we don't comment too much on intelligence matters, but we take into account the intelligence threat in information we receive around individuals and a threat to them. We regularly review the applications, and certainly where a threat increases or there's shown to be a demonstration of threat against that individual, we do seek to do what we can to protect them.
Bound.
Very much indeed, Mr Speaker. May I, with your permission, pay tribute to the outgoing Minister, the Honourable Gentleman for South West Wiltshire, who has many friends in this House and who made many friends in Northern Ireland. He's remembered with affection and respect. May I welcome the new Minister, my fifth to this dispatch box, and note that amongst them are 1 Royal Navy surgeon and 3 former Army officers, all of whom wore their uniform with great distinction, much more than I did, although admittedly the opportunity for gallantry is limited to London Transport bus conductors. Last year there were 550 12th of July parades. The vast majority went off peacefully. Does the Minister not agree that further reductions in the PSNI budget threaten the stability of the peace process? Will he make a statement?
Well, Obviously, Mr. Speaker, policing budgets are a matter for the Stormont and the Northern Ireland Executive, and it's why we are very keen to see the current impasse move on so they can make those decisions. But of course, to anyone in the parading environment, the message from the government is that violence does not pay. It helps neither side resolve the issues, and we urge them as much as possible to work together to resolve the long, often held disputes over parading.
Jake Berry.
Number 7, Mr. Speaker.
The political situation in Northern Ireland continues to be very difficult. It's essential that the current deadlock on welfare reform is resolved so the Stormont House Agreement can be implemented.
Would my right honourable friend say the impact that the failure to implement the Stormont House Agreement is having on the international reputation of the Northern Ireland Assembly?
I think it does have a negative impact on the reputation for Northern Ireland. Of course, it's crucially important that we're all promoting Northern Ireland around the world as a great place in which to invest, and part of that is ensuring that we can deliver political stability. So that is yet another reason why the Stormont House Agreement needs to go ahead.
Mr. Gregory Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Secretary of State agree with me that the political impasse that goes on at the moment as a result of two parties failing to implement the Stormont House Agreement is costing us about 50,000 private sector jobs in terms of corporation tax reductions being held up and investment in the likes of Ballykelly Camp in my constituency?
Well, I think there is, of course, the direct consequences that we've talked about before in terms of public finances, the effectiveness of the executive. But yes, obviously the huge boost in jobs that could potentially come with corporation tax devolution is not going to be delivered unless a sustainable budget is settled and welfare reform is implemented.
Pat Glass.
Number 8, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
The threat from Northern Ireland-related terrorism continues to be severe. It's potentially lethal and it is enduring. It's been suppressed through the hard work of PSNI and MI5, but the need for a high state of vigilance remains.
At Glass.
Mr. Speaker, I've just heard the Minister passing the buck on the cuts to the Northern Ireland Police Service. But the situation in Northern Ireland goes on. There have been 171 bombings, shootings and paramilitary actions in the last year. What is the Minister doing to ensure that the PSNI has the resources they need to meet this ongoing security situation?
Stay.
The Government has provided £230 million in extra security funding for the PSNI. The primary responsibility for funding the PSNI rests with the Executive, but the Stormont House Agreement does have a provision to seek to protect their budget, and this is yet another reason why this welfare question must be settled, because the PSNI are amongst other frontline services who will suffer directly if it is not, and if the Executive starts to run out of money because its budget is unworkable.
Kinahan.
The residents in Randallstown, Ballyclare and Antrim in my patch are all suffering from the police cuts. If the Stormont House Agreement or the Welfare Agreement doesn't happen, will you guarantee that there's enough funding going through so that we do have enough police on the ground?
The security situation is one that we monitor at all times, and of course the security implications of the current political impasse are something which will be an important part of our thinking in how we approach it. It is vital that this question is resolved. There is a question for Sinn Féin and SDLP. Do they want to spend this money on a more expensive welfare system, or do they want to fund frontline public service?
Ian Paisley.
Belfast woman Maria Cahill was raped by Michael Morris. His crime was covered over by Patrick Wilson. Both those individuals' trials have collapsed. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that there is a worrying trend that legacy cases in Northern Ireland involving senior Republicans are not resulting in convictions?
Well, it's obviously not appropriate for me to comment on the outcome of a particular court case, but obviously these events were very shocking. I think this is another reason why it's important to press ahead with the new structures on the past, including the Historical Investigations Unit, the ICIR, which were agreed as part of the Stormont House Agreement, because the current systems are not providing good enough outcomes for victims and survivors, and their interest should be at the heart of the actions of all of us here in this House. and in the Northern Ireland Assembly.
Sir David Hanson.
For 9, Mr Speaker.
Secretary of State.
The devolved institutions are responsible for setting a viable budget for Northern Ireland. Under the Stormont House Agreement, the Government provided £2 billion of additional spending power to help deal with problems which are specific to Northern Ireland, such as addressing the legacy of the past.
Hanson.
Respecting the devolution process and while respecting the Stormont House Agreement, there is still a £600 million potential black hole in the budget. What steps will the Secretary of State take to bring the parties together to resolve that issue?
Well, I have an almost continuous round of meetings with the Northern Ireland political parties. I have a review meeting of the Stormont House Agreement on Thursday alongside Minister Flanagan from the Irish Republic. I will be doing everything I can to get the process back on the road, but fundamentally it's down to Sinn Féin and SDLP to live up to the commitments they made under the Stormont House Agreement.
Robertson.
Mr Speaker, Secretary of State, you'll be aware that the Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland made a great play in London at the weekend about how the vulnerable are hurting. Can the Secretary of State remind our Deputy First Minister that the vulnerable have been hurting while the impasse over the Stormont House Agreement continues, and they will continue to hurt should there not be any progress on this issue?
He's absolutely right that taking an irresponsible approach to the public finances means that the people who really suffer are the most vulnerable in our community, and that is why difficult decisions are needed in Stormont to ensure that they can pass a sustainable budget and get the Stormont House Agreement back on track.